Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation, firstly, and for the introduction. Just as a start off, my background is in occupational hygiene. So just that you know that I'm not a nurse, so the health aspect sometimes is pretty daunting to me as well. And just before I jump into my slides, and I'm also going to try and have 20 seconds to spare at the end, some of the topics that was touched on, like climate change and the impact on workers, that is also a concern for the department. And the reason why I am leaving directly after questions and answers is I'm on my way to do a presentation with regards to the effect of climate change in the agriculture sector specifically. So the department is hosting several seminars for the agriculture sector on that specific topic. So maybe that's something that we can explore in future to expand on. So I was given kind of an interesting brief. It's not what I'm used to. So that is not the contents of my presentation. That is just sort of the outlines as to what I'm going to try and focus on. And I am going to abuse the opportunity to invite you to make comments on a piece of legislation that is currently out for public comment. So part of my request, I'm not moving here. Green button.
Deets, we've got a frozen presentation.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Third time lucky. So, now we move to 4. Okay. So that was one of the questions that were asked of me for the presentation. And I'm going to try and answer that question like a politician in a roundabout way. So from the Department of Employment and Labour's point of view, why are we so concerned about chemicals? And specifically pesticides and that group of chemicals where we have designed them to have specific hazards. They are dangerous because we designed them to be dangerous for a specific reason. So we are concerned about for our workers because they can get exposed. So they are not the intended target, but through the procedures they get exposed. So we are concerned because it can be inhaled. You can breathe in a chemical. You can ingest it either by accident or on purpose, and it can also be absorbed through the skin. So from occupational hygiene point of view, this is what is important to us. And you will see later when we start talking about controlling these exposures, why that all those 3 aspects needs to be considered. So every workplace where employer causes or have exposure to hazardous chemical agents, there must be a documented risk assessment. And the legislation requires this to be carried out immediately when that operation starts. And then it must be reviewed or updated, not exceeding 24 months. And it needs to be conducted by a competent person. Now we'll talk about competent person a little bit later in the presentation as well. And it must include at least the following: the nature of the task specific to the exposure, the duration and frequency of exposure, because that will tell how much of this chemical are you actually absorbing through the skin or breathing in. Previous results of exposure monitoring. Now exposure monitoring is a test that hygienists do to see how much of a chemical is in the air that you are actually breathing in. Information provided by the manufacturer or importer. Now this we get through the safety data sheet, and that information is vital to the occupational hygienist and then to the employer as well. Then hazardous properties that are given to us on the safety data sheet, and then routes of intake. As I already said, those are the 3 routes that we are concerned about. Other things that needs to be considered during the process of risk assessment is activities such as maintenance. These are things that don't happen on a day-to-day basis. They are outside of the norm. And we find that people then relax and think, because I'm not doing the actual job, I'm doing something on the sideline, they don't consider exposure then. And we then end up exposing our maintenance people to a much higher level than the workers that actually perform the normal day-to-day tasks and are provided with the proper controls and protection. Effectiveness of prevention and control measures, we find often when we visit employers that they spend a lot of money and they have these great control measures in place, but they never check, are they actually working? Are they actually doing the thing that they want them to do to reduce or eliminate the exposure of the employees. Records of adverse health outcomes. So when we get the occupational medical practitioners, the nurses and the doctors involved, they will be able to tell us if you have exposure to this kind of chemical, and we have seen the health classes just in some of the previous presentations, they will be able to tell us what are the adverse health effects on those employees. And that needs to be considered in the risk assessment as well. Obviously, when you think of a carcinogen, that is something that gets higher priority than something that can just, maybe cause dermatitis on the skin. And then a new move in our legislation that some of you might have noticed is the different effects of exposure to chemicals to women, young employees, and vulnerable employees, so that it needs to be an additional consideration for these classes of workers, because they might be, because of their age or whatever reason, they might be more susceptible to the hazards that these chemicals hold for all of us. Then there's requirements for a risk assessment to be reviewed, and this obviously when there's a change in procedure. If you're going to do things differently, it might impact the hazard. Also, if there's a change in product, in the hazard chemical agent that you are using, then it might influence the hazard that you are facing, and you need to review your risk assessment. And then also reporting of incidents, near misses, serious incidences that either need first aid or hospitalization, or people being not fit to continue work anymore. All those need to be considered in your risk assessment. So now, why have I told you about the risk assessment and not tell you what PPE to put in place? Because the risk assessment, from the point of view of occupational health and safety, is the basis for everything. If you don't have a customized risk assessment for your specific operation, you don't know what your hazards are. You don't know what are the risks that you are exposing yourselves and your employees to. So there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to occupational health and safety. So from that risk assessment, you will know, do I need to perform air monitoring conducted by a hygienist? Do I have to have a OMP, an occupational medical practitioner, on board to do medical assessments and screening of my staff? Do I need to look for alternatives for my products? So only from the risk assessment will you be able to customize and answer those questions for your specific scenario. So when it comes to the control of these exposures, we in occupational hygiene refer to the hierarchy of control, and there are certain steps that needs to be followed. And these are listed there in a ranking of priority. So the first prize is if we can eliminate. If we have a carcinogen, maybe we can remove that specific substance and replace it with something which isn't a carcinogen. Or maybe remove the chemical from the entire scenario totally. Elimination is, as I said, first prize, but that is also, I think, the most difficult one. Substitution, can I maybe substitute it for a less hazardous substance? Engineering controls, so this is engineering through ventilation or eliminating the contact from the employee with that substance. And then administrative controls is things like shifts, how long are they exposed, the frequency of exposure, the duration of exposure. Training and information will also be part of administrative control. And then lastly, only PPE. So only after you have considered all those other things do you end up with PPE. And I know we are all so quick to run to PPE because it's the obvious answer. If somebody gets skin contact, give him gloves. That is, have you ever worked for 8 hours in 40 degrees with some gloves? It's extremely uncomfortable. So is wearing a mask to protect you from breathing it in. We all know that after the pandemic where we had to walk around on a day-to-day basis with masks, we all know it is so uncomfortable. You can imagine that in that heat. And also people tend to, if the boss isn't there or the supervisor is there checking if you are actually wearing the gloves and the mask, because it's not comfortable, they won't wear it. So you give a false sense of protection when it comes to PPE. So we are not very keen on PPE there. There we go. So another way of looking at exposure control is where can we implement the control? So my little pictures there down at the bottom, those vats or those containers there contain a chemical, so that is the source of our exposure. So you can either control it at the source, prevent or eliminate contact between the worker and the source of the hazard. Along the pathway, you can put a barrier on, you can provide ventilation, so some of the things you can implement along the pathway, or you can do the control measure at the employee. You can put up a barrier. You can put in machinery, mechanize the entire process so that there isn't contact between the employee and that work process. So yeah, that just gets me back to, I'm unable to give you a one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to controls and PPE for that matter. It needs to be customized for what you are doing and what kind of equipment and materials, raw materials that you are using. What is nice from the GHS system, if you have the proper classification and you have that information available on a safety data sheet, you get told on the safety data sheet, what are my concerns? Is it something that I need to be concerned about for skin absorption? Or is it only something that workers can breathe in? Is it something that is flammable? Or what other properties does this chemical have? So that is why we are so keen to get the GHS up and running and have that information available to all employees. And as it was said, we consider everybody along the value chain in some way is either an employee, and in some very few cases you will find self-employed people. So this legislation then applies to all of them, all along the value chain. Okay, so you all know about the GHS system. You all know when it came to effect. You know that there was a transition period, and then there was a general extension granted. And so my question then today is how are we doing with that implementation? And I must say from where I sit in the department, it seems that the agri-chemical sector, or part of the chemical sector, that agri-sector, is actually doing better than the other chemicals. If we look at some of our more household chemicals or the other industrial chemicals, some of them are really struggling, and they really just wish that this would go away. But it's like agri-chemicals, you guys have got a much better grasp, and that you appreciate the urgency that is around this. So please keep that up for those of you who are still on the route. Those of you who are already there, thank you for joining us on that. So as I said, I'm going to abuse my platform this morning to just give you a little bit of a feedback on the draft regulations for hazardous chemical agents. And hopefully all of you know that it is currently out for public comment. That public comment phase closes on the... My time is up.
No. We break you up into different sections.
Okay, no, thank you. So I've got some new time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that piece of legislation is out for public comment until the 5th of July. So please, if there is something that you think that we missed out on, that you think we can improve, you don't need to check it for spelling errors or typing errors, something like that. We'll send it to language editing after this process is done. But if you find something, you're more than welcome to point that out to us. So this contents is basically the contents of the regulations, and I'm not going to take you through everything on there. It's just for you to have an idea of what is going on in the regulation. And I must apologize from here on, my presentation gets even more boring because it is a presentation on legislation, and there's only so much you can do with legislation. So the scope of all legislation, it tells you where it is applicable, and it is applicable for any employee or self-employed person that may expose their workers or themselves to hazardous chemical agents. So as I said, we basically view everybody along the value chain as an employer. So we know that the classification of hazardous chemical agents according to the GHS is the requirement that is placed on the manufacturer or importer. Now in the draft that is out for public comment, we didn't really change very much around the classification requirements. Maybe tweak the wording a little bit here and there. When it comes to safety data sheet, also we didn't do too much changes on this piece of the legislation because it is already in place and everything is covered there. What we did add there is that the safety data sheet needs to be developed by a competent person. So that is new. And I think that's pretty important. As I said, maybe not so much for the agrochemical sector, but some of the other role players are really struggling with this. So then, when must this safety data sheet be provided and when must it obtain? That also didn't change. Everybody along the value chain must have access to that vital information. Also, double duty here, we say that it must be provided by the manufacturer importer, but we put another responsibility on the employer to obtain it. So there can't be a finger pointing. You didn't give it, you didn't ask it. Both has that legal duty to provide. When we get to the sections or the different parts in the safety data sheet, nothing has changed there. You will just note that we have removed the word section in front of the numbering. It just it seemed to be more in line with what is happening internationally rather than referring to those as sections. But I mean, it doesn't really impact the content. It's just the last of the 16 headings there. Then labeling also didn't very much change there. There's still a requirement for the manufacturer importer to develop the labels because they are the ones that know the formula. They know what is in that chemical, what are the hazards, what are the GHS implications that should be on the label. Please, if you don't have a copy of the draft, you're more than welcome to contact me or via the CropLife office. We'll gladly provide you with a copy of the draft regulation, and please provide us with your comments. As I say, there's not much has changed there. When it comes to labeling, there is still sections that must be included in the label, and then there are a few bullets there that may be included, depending obviously on space or additional information that the manufacturer would like to provide to the end user. Packaging, also you'll see nothing much change there. What is important to us is that the label information goes along with that product all through its product life cycle, so that everybody can have an opportunity to know what the hazards are associated with the products that they are using. Okay, disclosure of ingredients, you will know that's also important to us. What has changed there, we have widened those ranges just to make it, we don't want manufacturers to disclose their confidential business information. That is not the intent of this. But that the protection of business information can't happen at the cost of the health and safety of anybody down the line. So we need that information, but we do give some grace there to allow for specific formulas and quantities to remain a secret to the manufacturer. Now, moving on to the competent person. Now, in the regulation, there is a comprehensive definition there. Basically, what is saying that we consider a person with adequate applicable knowledge, training, and experience in that specific field, and this field would be, in this case, GHS or chemicals management, to be a competent person, and that person would be considered adequate to do the GHS classification. So it's important that the competent person then takes responsibility, and if an employer then appoints a competent person or a manufacturer appoints a competent person, that they must be able to justify why they are considering this person to be competent to perform that task. It's not for the department to give a list of maybe job titles or say nurses or doctors or hygienists are the only ones that are competent, because the field is broad and we all come from it from different sides. In addition to this definition, the department has also developed a specific guideline document, and I can make that available through the CropLife offices. it gives you a little bit more background information on how to actually evaluate somebody, whether or not they are competent. The nice thing about that document, and then also this definition, is that if you and I look at somebody's knowledge, training, and experience, we should all come to the same conclusion. If I say that that person is competent, if you take the same tick sheet, basically, you would come to the same conclusion that that person is competent. So that is the intent. It's not a matter of the department getting into an argument with the employer about whether or not somebody is competent. If they meet that requirement, we should all see the competency clearly. If you are in doubt and you end up getting into an argument with somebody about it, then maybe the competency isn't so clear. So hopefully that gives a little bit of more guidance. If you remember, we're now saying that the safety data sheet needs to be developed by a competent person. We are also asking for the risk assessment to be done by a competent person. But remember, those two competencies specifically could be two different people. It's not necessarily that the person that are competent to do the safety data sheet also has the competency to do a risk assessment, and vice versa. Then to this regulation, we also have a guideline. So this regulation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act is unique in that way, and we kind of inherited it like that from 1995. And we are sticking to it because we really find this guidance document to be very useful. So that is a place where we can expand on some of the topics in the regulation and provide a little bit of more guidance and clearance, and we can even address some of the topics that are not directly addressed in the regulation. So that is the contents of the Annex 4, the guideline to the regulations. And when you are looking at GHS implementation and all the matters around GHS, then paragraphs 4 to 25 are the ones that you would want to look at. You're more than welcome to look at the rest, but they do get a little bit technical and in various fields. And GHS is then the one that we deal with. Firstly, in the guidance note, because everything starts with a classification. If we can get the classification right and we have that information available, everything else runs very smoothly. And that also goes for the regulation. We have changed the sequence of the regulations from the one that was published in 2021. We're now starting off with GHS classification and labeling, and then the safety data sheet. That's just the way it should be. There's some more topics in the guideline. And looking at what those paragraphs actually say. So this is just an expansion of what the GHS is, and we're talking about the 2-year phase-in period. Now, I've tried to put in there how we envisage the movement from one revision of the Purple Book to the next, but I feel that the table following on that actually makes a little bit more sense and is a little bit easier to read. So every second year in December, the subcommittee on GHS actually agrees on a new version of the GHS. But in December, when they approve it at the meeting in Geneva, it is not available to the public. It takes another 6 months for them to go through their language editing and printing processes and all those things. So it only becomes available in July to the stakeholders outside of that subcommittee to actually implement. So we thought it would be unreasonable to expect the implementation phase for that new revision, let's say revision 10, in December when it was agreed on, for that implementation stage to start then already, when only after 6 months you will actually get a copy of that document. So the implementation stage for South Africa will only start in July of that specific year. And then you will have that period to actually implement. So if you look at revision 10, it was published in July 2023, and we will expect full implementation of revision 10 in June 2025, or at the beginning of July, basically it should be in place. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, please, during this phase, give me some proposals as to how to make that a little bit more clear. So yeah, the intent is just to allow a reasonable time to move on to the newest revisions. So, expert judgment on human case reports must be guide used for classification of corrosive agents if inevitable skin damage or the skin was observed. So these are just some of the competent authority decisions that isn't covered directly in the regulation, and we then provide some guidance in the guidance note. In the case of respiratory of skin sensitizers, subcategories may be applied where sufficient data is available, obviously dependent on the data. The GHS requirements for classification, labeling, safety data sheets are not applicable to low-level pesticide residues in foodstuffs, cosmetics, or pharmaceuticals in their final form. I had some thoughts about this paragraph. The idea is out there that we should maybe move a little bit closer to the exact wording that is in the Purple Book itself, but to me that is pretty clear as to what the intent is. But yeah, if there's any thoughts from your side, please let us know. Hazard classes and categories provided in Table 3 for environmental hazards and in Annex 1 is intended as a guidance for classification of chemicals only. So this is only applicable to our legislation from the Department of Employment and Labour because of our mandate. We don't have a mandate on the environment, on the environmental hazards. So this is then incorporated into the legislation of the Department of Fisheries, Forestry and the Environment. And we consult with them on which building blocks to include. But our legislation gives those building blocks, but only as a guidance. So that means that if a labour inspector comes to your site, they will not be able to actually give you a notice if you have classified something incorrectly when it comes to the environmental hazards, because our mandate is limited to the health and the physical ones. But we thought it would be very confusing to exclude it from our legislation, so it is there, but only as a guidance. Then we talk a little bit about the label size there and where additional information can be obtained on label elements. That was in the regulation in the past as well. And then pictograms, that was also in the previous regulation. So if you don't intend on exporting the product, a manufacturer or importer can actually only have that little pictogram with the red diamond. They can have it in only black and white. Might save some cost. And the inclusion of all ingredients or elements of an alloy that contribute to the hazard of the mixture should be on the label. So if there's a contribution to any of the hazard classes, we need to know about that. Where mixture is supplied exclusively for workplace use, and that is obviously where the Department of Employment and Labour are concerned about, the chemical identities may only be provided on the safety data sheet. So the reasoning behind that is that the safety data sheet doesn't necessarily go along with consumer products as we know it. It goes into the work environment. So if there's only use in the work environment of a specific substance, then that information doesn't necessarily need to be on the label as well. I'm not so sure that that is something that is applicable to agrochemicals, but you would know better than that. Where the packaging of a substance or mixture is either in such a shape or form or so small that it is impossible to provide all the elements of the labeling, the following minimum information can be provided. So that is just to accommodate very small containers, and it gives you a minimum, if because of space on the label, you cannot fit everything in there. The safety of the GHS label for a hazardous chemical at the workplace must be maintained on a supplied container in the workplace. So this puts a responsibility of, if there is decanting at the workplace, that label information must go along with that product. We need everybody to know what the hazards are associated with the products that they are dealing with. So communication of hazards information must be provided for carcinogens, reproductive toxicity and specific targets on through repeated exposure on the label and on the safety data sheet. For metals and alloys, communication of the hazard information may be provided through the safety data sheet alone, if it's not dispensable. There is a substance or mixture is classified as corrosive to metals but not corrosive to skin or eyes that has a pictogram linked to corrosive to metals must be provided on the label as such substance or mixture which are packed in its finished state. So you will know that that corrosive pictogram actually has either a little hand that indicates skin corrosion and then a piece of metal. So the idea behind that is that you can't remove one. They are both there, and that pictogram then applies to both corrosive to metal and corrosive to skin. So you will see that in this guideline we try to address all the competent authority decisions that are in the domain of the Department of Employment and Labour. A safety data sheet should be developed for mixtures which are not classified for acute toxic or aquatic toxicity as a result of the application of the additive formula, but which contain acute toxic or toxic to aquatic environment ingredients on concentration equal to or greater than 1. So yeah, that I would like to hear the opinion, especially from our colleagues from Environmental Affairs, if this competent authority decision actually belongs in our legislation. So during comment phase, we would be keen to know that. None of the 16 SDS heading sections, except heading 16, which is other information, may be left without any text. So we don't want to see the words like it's not applicable or information not available. Or if that is the case, we want to see those words. Don't just skip the heading. Give the reason why there is no information to give. Is it either because it's inconclusive or there is no information available? So what we are saying that none of those 16 headings, except for 16, can be left empty. We don't want people to try and take shortcuts and not provide the needed information that needs to be on the safety data sheet to protect workers and everybody's health and safety. The term cutoff value are used and can also be meant a concentration limit. And this I find that industry, and maybe it's more from the industrial chemicals, there are different terminologies used. There's threshold limits, there are trace limits, but the GHS talk about cutoff limits, and that is what we will use in the legislation. So what we are trying to do there is also to provide a little bit of information from the competent authority decision side, and once again we have a table that I think is more explanatory than the actual text in the paragraphs above. And I don't think there's anything funny around those cutoff values. It's very much in line with what the European Union has in place. Then this is just a paragraph on the precautionary statements and what the competent authority is. The general precautionary statements are not linked to a certain hazard class or category, shall also be used where relevant. Precautionary statements that appear on the label or the safety data sheet may incorporate minor textual variations. So if there is a difference in the spelling, for instance, between the American version and the British version and the South African version, those differences are allowed. Then we have a read across just to make the carcinogenicity. There are different systems of classifying the carcinogens, and we try to give a little bit of a read across from those various. In occupational health and hygiene, different systems are being used. For instance, the American Conference for Governmental Industrial Hygienists has got a different system of providing a CARC notation to a specific substance. And we just try to give that in this table. So if you have the GHS class and you have the ACGIH, that you know what the difference means to the system that you are actually familiar with. Then we have an explanation on the UN number, the 4-digit number there, where it originates from. And then finally we have a list of the competent authorities in South Africa and their contact details. So the idea is that some of the competent authority decisions that not lie with the Department of Employment and Labour. It lies with our colleagues at one of those 3 departments. And then if you need to get a hold of them, you don't necessarily need to get a hold of me first to get to them. It will then be published in the guideline. And yeah, we'll see. We've specifically sent this draft also to these departments asking for their input. So we'll see if they provide us with maybe some alternative contact details to include in the regulation. So as I said, this draft and these guidelines in Annex 4 are now out for public comment, and we invite you to please, as a sector, your inputs are very important to us. We would like to make sure that this is a usable document for you and that it is understandable. So if there's something that you want to add, if there's something that we missed, please provide it during this process. There is a dedicated email that you can use for this. You're also more than welcome to contact me. We have a specific format that we like these comments to come in. If you'd like to get an editable version of that, we can easily provide that. I would just ask you to please, when you do make a comment, please don't put it in a question form. Don't ask, so why are there 16 headings on the safety data sheet? This is not going to be a debate during public comment. I will not be able to, under the amount of comments that come in, to engage you and try to explain to you first and try and answer your question. I'm just going to take your question to the technical committee, and the technical committee can say, it's already there. And you're never going to get an answer to your question. So don't phrase your comments in a question. And along with that, make a proposal. If there is something that you don't like, don't just say, I don't like the 16 headings. Then come up with a proposal and give us an idea of what would you then like to see. It just makes it so much easier then for the technical committee to actually consider your proposal and to understand the reasoning why you are proposing a change or why you don't like something specific. That will also give you an idea of the public comments. Are not considered by me only. We have a technical committee that comprises of organized business and organized labor, as well as government, and then some other sector experts that provide us with input when we are considering these comments. Then lastly on this invitation is all your comments will be considered. Considered, not necessarily included. So consideration can have 2 outcomes. We can agree with you and we can actually implement a change in the draft regulation, or we don't agree with you, or we agree with you partially and we maybe take a part of, but the committee will definitely consider all of your comments. But there won't be a back and forth discussion. Should it happen that we don't fully understand your proposal, we can contact you and invite you maybe to come talk to the technical committee or provide me with information to take to the technical committee. So please make sure that you do provide your contact details to us as well if we need to engage to get some clarity. But there won't be, in general, a back and forth and discussion and debate around your comments. There's too many comments and there's too little time for all of that. So that is me. Thank you very much.